Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Genia Simkin, who is a technologist, analyst, comedian, musician, and entrepreneur who fled with his family to the United States from the former Soviet Union in 1978 during the mass Soviet Jewish exodus of the 1970s. Recently, after Russia invaded Ukraine, Genia co-founded Samizdat Online, an anti-censorship media platform that uses unique intellectual property to make it possible to bypass internet blocking commonly practiced by autocratic regimes such as Putin's. Genia Simkin, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks so much, John. Really grateful to have to be on the show.
Right. And by the way, to our audience, a thank you to Josh or Bugsy Siegel, who introduced me and Genia. So thank you, Josh, for that. So the conversation that I'd like to have with you today, Genia, will cover how your technology helps users bypass DNS blockades. But before we get into this topic, could we start, please, by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you prefer, the times in which we live?
Yeah, sure. We live in extremely interesting times. They are in some ways, in many ways, the best times humanity has ever known, depending on how you're measuring. The longest, the most prosperity, the longest peace, in spite of what you see on the news. Things like that. And then simultaneously, they're very fraught times because we are encountering all sorts of challenges that we have never encountered before, and so we don't know exactly how to deal with them. The information landscape, which you focus on, well, we both focus on, is it's a giant funhouse mirror attraction at some carnival, and we being a very specific kind of social ape and having very specific kind of social ape expectations from our environment are subjected to an endless barrage of what we perceive as lunacy. And we really don't know what to do with that. And it kind of undermines our ability to operate in a in a feeling of safety and predictability. Apes really need predictability, and that we feel. I feel I'm going to speak for the entire human race right now.
Sure.
Everybody feels like we're living on the precipice of some kind of calamity, even if we can't even identify exactly what that calamity is. We try to put our finger on it. We call it climate change, we call it autocracy, we call it all sorts of things. But if you were to sit down and try to say, like, well, what's my worst fear? What's going to happen tomorrow, right? Never mind 10 years from now, but just tomorrow, what's the worst thing that can happen? It's hard to come up with something genuinely cataclysmic, and yet it feels like we're living on the precipice of a cataclysm of some kind. So that's my assessment of the present times.
Yeah, 100% agree with all of that. At the very top of that, you said, yeah, we live in interesting times. And curiously, there's a well-known Chinese proverb that basically says that. The proverb is, may you live in interesting times. And I think, thoughtful people, I think that that's probably true for any time, right? And the challenges that we face today in 2024, and by the way, again, to our audience, we're recording this on August 5th, 2024. The challenges that we face today are literally unique to us. This problem space has never before been encountered. But the same could be said for the generation 20 years ago, and the generation 40 years ago, and the generation 60 years ago, right? Every generation experiences their version of the world's challenges, and it's up to us now to figure out how do we grapple with and manage and or in some instances overcome the challenges that are being delivered to us by just global circumstance. I mean, do you what are your thoughts about that?
Yes, I think that there is something unique about the kinds of challenges that humans started facing, let's broadly speaking, say about 100 years ago, right? I think
Yep.
up until then, you could have, put a thumbtack in any point in the timeline of humanity, and the problems would have been more or less the same. You'd had, where do we find our food? How do we prevent, the being sacked by our neighbors? When's the next plague coming? That those were more or less the things that people faced over and over and over again. And then about 100 years ago, things started getting much more interesting. And yes, so I agree that over the so 60 years, definitely I will 100% concede. One other point, I think, so I'm not a specialist in Chinese culture, but my understanding is that the may you live in interesting times is actually a pejorative. It's meant
Oh,
as an
really?
insult. Yeah, I think so. I'm obviously I'm not gonna start Googling it now, but my understanding is that it is thrown around as an invective where you're trying to insult somebody. You're kind of wishing ill on them because the worst thing that can happen for someone is to be living in interesting times because
Oh, is that right? Well, that's the beauty of it. It has so many interpretations, you know.
Mhm.
Okay, fair enough. Um, do you think, Genia, that you could just take a moment? The bio or the introduction that I gave at the top really didn't do, your life and career justice. Do you think you could maybe take just a moment and tell our audience a little bit more about yourself and your life and experiences, and also maybe how it relates to some of the work that you're doing today as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually it does it that background is actually essential context for
Okay,
once we get to
great.
discussing Samizdat. Yeah, so I was born in 71 in Soviet Russia, and Soviet Russia was a pretty horrible place for Jews. Which is why when the opportunity presented itself for us to flee, so many of us did. I believe it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5 million Soviet Jews wound up fleeing over the course of about 10 years. My parents were both very educated, as is pretty common in our culture. My father was a professor of psychiatry, and in spite of his very academic background, he developed a practice, an Eastern practice that focused primarily on things like yoga and meditation, which he incorporated into his psychiatric practice. And then it was actually that practice that wound up being the main catalyst for us departing Soviet Russia. So in essence, he found yoga, which he felt he needed in order to cure his tuberculosis, which he developed. And he used, all sorts of yogic breathing and so forth to actually to rid himself of tuberculosis. So, I mean, it's an anecdote of one, but empirically, he did in fact cure himself of tuberculosis, which was not otherwise going away. Um, so the thing is that yoga was a forbidden knowledge in Soviet Russia.
Is that
It
right?
was, yeah, they thought of it as an anti-Marxist ideology,
Hmm.
and so along with so much else, everything was censored. And the only way that my father could get his hands on anything related to this study was through what was then called samizdat, and we'll get to what samizdat means. But it was a practice of underground grassroots distribution of forbidden content that ran the gamut. It was not certainly some of it was political, but as I said, as this example illustrates, much of it wasn't. So then we came to America, and I lived a pretty interesting and varied life as a musician and a comedian and all sorts of other things. And then um, when I was in my mid 20s, late 20s, something like that, I having always had been sort of computery, just a nerdy computer kid, it was always part of my bio. I fell in love with the World Wide Web was just coming online. This was 1996 or so, and I just really wanted to take part in that, and so I basically taught myself some very nascent programming skills and got a job at CBS News. And again, at the time, it was extremely easy to get anything web related in terms of work, because if you knew that the letters H, T, M, and L went in that order, you had a job. Like that was the sum total of the knowledge you needed to have.
Okay, yeah.
It's a very, very interesting time in technological history, because like real programmers, like the kinds of programmer who I became later, we didn't want anything to do with having to sit in front of bad designs made in bad Photoshop, and then laying them out in half-assed HTML, which is what everybody needed at that time. Like every manufacturer or store or a brand needed a website. So they really couldn't be very choosy or picky as to who they hired. So really, it did fall on the very unwashed, semi-literate technology masses to go and assemble all of that. And I was part of that. So CBS News happened to be a very interesting place to cut my technological teeth because, well, CBS News, it was a
Yeah,
really
yeah.
fascinating place to be. And again, quite serendipitously, as so many things in my life have been, I wound up being there at the specific transition where not just CBS, but all news was treated as a loss leader industry where nobody was expecting it to be a profit center, and it was meant to just inform people. And the ethos had always been very highfalutin, and I would call it hoity-toity.
This is about what year, Genia?
This is 90, like, so this specifically was 97.
Okay, okay.
And at that time, there was a giant mural of Edward R. Murrow in our office, and we would routinely have Dan Rather come through and give us these very heartfelt speeches about what our, who we are as a people and as an industry and as a profession, and how important it all is. And at the time, there was already there were the beginnings of pressure from corporate to start to introduce advertising and to start making money. And Dan, very good-naturedly, and I would at this point argue very naively, insisted that he was going to be able to stand somehow between us and them, and give us the bandwidth we need to just do things in whatever I'm not even sure what the words anymore are, but there was some very high-minded and lofty ambition to keep journalism protected from the need to be profitable. And that, as we now know, that initiative failed kind of catastrophically and kind of spectacularly, and that kind of brings us to where we are today in the certainly in the Western journalistic realm, where everybody has to everybody's desperate to stay afloat, and the David Lettermans and the CSIs and the Survivors of the world are no longer funding that initiative. So now everybody has to actually pay their own way, and that leads to, as it turns out, because of human nature and because of the kinds of things that people find fascinating and engaging, now we're in a world where news is skewed very much towards the sensational rather than towards the purely informative.
For profit incentives and whatnot, audience capture, not wanting to upset or turn off audiences because eyeballs, or it's the competition for attention, right? And attention is monetizable. Attention becomes data. Data becomes something sellable, and round and round it goes.
And all of that, yes, and also the most unfortunate reality is that the things that are the most upsetting are the most engaging. So the best way you can attract an audience is to spin something in a way that will provoke and I mean, it's again, taps directly into who we are as a creature. We're apes, right? And when we were sitting in the trees and somebody would yell leopard or whatever the
Mm.
ape signal for leopard
Yeah,
is,
yeah,
that was the thing you were the most attuned to. Like, nobody was gonna yell that that there's a nice breeze coming from the southwest.
that's
That's
right.
just
Yeah, yeah. I read somewhere. I should look this up. But yeah, when the telegraph first came about in, let's say, the 1850s or something like that, right? But when the telegraph wires first got spread out across America, or maybe Western Europe as well. But anyway, one of the very first things that was sent across the wires was bad news. It was something about a fire, but it kind of just goes to show that that the sensationalized, or people are tuned into bad news or information which is potentially perilous. Yeah, so I mean, it's definitely an attention-getting medium, I would say. Also, you said something that reminded me. I've got another podcast discussion coming up with a gentleman who has really done a lot of analysis on the news. And one of the things that he said in his book that I found really interesting was, I'm paraphrasing this, but basically, there is money in the problem. There
Mm.
there are incentives to keep problems unsolved. I mean,
Mhm.
this is kind of jaded or cynical, I guess, but I think that there's some truth in it. So, solving problems is not in the best interests of of news outlets or even politicians, right? Because if if a problem is live, is active, then you can use that problem as a foil or
Mm.
as a discussion like punching bag or something like that in order to keep people's emotions high and ultimately monetizable, right? So I'm not intending this to be a controversial statement. I'm using this as an illustration. So climate change, okay? There's lots of different people that have different opinions about climate change. I think most people, if they're being honest, they'll agree that there's some sort of a man-made component to climate change. It may not be the whole story, but people are having an effect. But the point is climate change is such an emotional topic that there is a whole industry which is built upon climate change being a live problem within our public discourse, right? There's all kinds of uh, my I'm failing to think of examples, right? But there are millions of jobs and dozens of nonprofit organizations that are built upon climate change being a problem, and so keeping climate change a problem in effect is fueling a whole bunch of economic activity, I guess is the point I'm trying to make. Anyway, do
Yeah. No,
you have
I can.
do you have any comment on that? There's a
Yeah,
question
yeah.
in there somewhere.
I do. No, yeah. So I think what everything you just said is true, but if you follow that thread to its logical end, you're going to wind up at a place where people do end up, and I find it very troubling, and I'm positive that they're wrong. You wind up at the place where there's some sort of conspiratorial, almost cabal
Hmm.
related decision at the top that we're going to make climate change a problem in order to blah blah blah. Like that is not how anything works.
Yeah.
The way it works is there is climate change. Different people feel differently about it. Most people feel pretty strongly about the way you described it to be. And then at the very granular level, you wind up people doing whatever it is they're doing. And then you wind up at the end, out of all these grains of sand, you wind up with a beach. but it wasn't like somebody
Yeah,
decided
yeah,
we're
yeah.
gonna make a beach here, right? Like the beach just is. It's there because over time the sand has accumulated in that way. And I think there is and social media really enforces this. There's this tendency to miss those intermediary one grain at a time points, which are invisible, right? They're not there to be introspected. You can introspect the whole thing, and then it's tempting to say that someone's behind this or some group is behind this, and that there's this, but that's not the way it is. So
Hmm.
the same is true of the information space you're describing. There wasn't a cabal-like gathering where Les Moonves and Mel Karmazin, who headed CBS in 1997, got together with whoever was at the helm of ABC and the New York Times and every other media organization and said, okay, here we go. We're gonna do this. Like we're gonna make everybody very, very agitated and make them angry and make them petrified. They were each individually in their tiny, tiny ways responding to the incentives that were in front of them, and that was it. And then
Yeah,
it added
yeah,
together to what we have today, which is this, it is it's not a beach, it's the Sahara Desert of this drive towards keeping people as agitated as possible because that is what makes money. And again, the agitations happen one article at a time, and the data is really clear that the articles that agitate are the ones that people read, and the articles that don't agitate are the ones that people skip. So then that's the incentive, right?
yeah.
It's not there wasn't a decision from the top at any point. It's just the way it is. The problem is how do you unwind it? Because there is no central authority that you can turn
Hmm.
to and say, "Hey, could you please turn this down a little bit? Like we don't need this." And it's driving everybody crazy, and it's giving everybody the background impression again, what I described right at the outset, this undertow of despair and depression and a feeling of hopelessness against the reality that if you just if you just take away this fog of news distress, and I urge people to do this in their own like day-to-day lives. Just take, I mean, I know that we're all very engaged and a lot of us do it professionally, but just take a week, just 1 week, like the next time you go on vacation, and just don't look at any news at all. Make it a decision. I'm just not going to look at the news, especially the news that you can't do anything about, the news that you're just keeping yourself kind of informed, right? Everybody wants to be informed, but unless you're working for the State Department, and if you are working for the State Department, then just don't read the news about climate change because you're not doing anything about that. So,
That's right. Yeah,
so
yeah.
just disengage completely and see what unbelievable, like it changes everything. Suddenly you're like, my world is fantastic. I mean, obviously not everybody's world is fantastic, and I'm not saying that like I sound callous, right? There's people
No,
living in
right.
actual war zones. Their lives are not fantastic. But most of us live in situations where you look outside the window, you go to the store, you go to the movies, you go to a restaurant with your family, you're going camping. Everything is just absolutely amazing. Like there's no shortage of anything. Everybody's perfectly happy. Like the poorest people today are orders of magnitude more. I mean, I don't want to call them rich. They're not. They're poor, but they have more resource access to resources and comforts and luxuries that okay, the joke I love to make is if you were to approach Louis the 14th, who
Hmm.
so by some estimates was the wealthiest man in the history of humanity, depending on how you calculate. And
Oh,
if
is
you were
that
to
right?
ask him
Okay.
what would he be willing to part with to have a working toilet in his bedroom, right? And my joke is he'd say like half of everything, just if I could just flush it and it goes away rather than it sitting in a pot under my bed and having people coming around like, and now like everybody in the Western world has a toilet. They don't think twice about it, right? It's just so, and again, the disparity between Louis the 14th's wealth and ours. So yeah, but yet there's this overwhelming prevailing feeling of calamity at our doorstep, and that's a self-fulfilling prophecy that's gonna lead to I mean, it will lead to that, I think, if we don't somehow take our foot off the gas pedal, we're gonna go off a cliff.
Yeah, yeah. there's so many other rabbit holes that I could go down with you on this, but we really haven't gotten to today's discussion topic, or this has all been a bit of a wind up to today's discussion topic. But I did want to say one last thing on this with your was it Louis the 14th or Louis
Yeah.
the 16th example?
I think it was the 14th.
The 14th, the 14th. But there's a great quote that I whip out every now and then from this philosopher. His name is Alfred North Whitehead. He was a philosopher from the late 1800s, early 1900s. He was actually the PhD dissertation advisor for, oh my goodness, I'm spacing on the guy's name, Bertrand Russell. He was his dissertation advisor. So,
Wow.
a lot of people have not heard of Whitehead today, but he was a pretty big deal back in his day. Anyway, one of the things that he said that I think dovetails right on top of what you were talking about there is he said, civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking about them. And so, like you're talking about Louis the 14th and flushing a toilet, like today, most people, I mean, there's still a billion people maybe in the world who, don't have flushing toilets for sure. But
Yeah.
most people in the world don't even think twice about it. The
Yeah.
toilet flushes, it just works, right? And so, can you imagine all of the infrastructure that has to be put into place before that is even a possibility? You
Right.
know,
Yeah.
there's so much technology and know-how and blood, sweat, and tears, and figuring stuff out in order to make that a reality. And now most people don't even think about it. In fact, most people probably can't even explain how plumbing works.
Yeah.
That's how much of a background,
Yeah.
capability it is. Anyway, I'll
Yeah.
put that little quote into the show notes. But
Yeah, you will, and I will send you the link, although you could find it yourself. There's a brilliant little essay of, I think it's from the 50s, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't remember who wrote it, but the essay is about the number two pencil and
yeah,
the
I pencil,
complexity.
I pencil.
I
Yeah,
pencil, yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I would encourage your listeners to read that if they haven't seen it, because it is marvelous how complex and yet at the same time transparently complex the world we live in is at this time.
Yeah, yeah. Right. Okay. Awesome. Well, to our audience, take all of that as like a backgrounder towards the kinds of problems that Genia and his team are swimming in and trying to, develop technologies which help with problems that cascade from all of that. Right. So let's talk about Samizdat. What does that mean, and how does that fit into the company that you're building and technology that you're building?
So the word itself, I mentioned it already. It literally translates into self-publication. Sam is that, and those are the two components of that word. So back in Soviet Russia, it was a grassroots undertaking where people had the agreement between each other that there would be information that would be smuggled into the country from some place, usually like Czechoslovakia, which was sort of porously on that border of the free and non-free world. And then that information would be two copies of it would be made by each individual who got their hands on it. Usually this was printed materials, so people would use carbon copy paper. Sometimes it was audio tapes, but each person would agree to, if they were given something from if somebody handed them a piece of this forbidden material, they would make two copies and hand them off and leave one for them. Like, so they'd leave one copy and make two more and hand them off, and then the recipients of that would make two more copies, and on and on. So this strategy, this understanding that the population itself has to be responsible for getting itself informed, is like it's in my DNA, right? As a human being and as somebody who came through this culture, I am sold, and you will not be able, like, we can get into a strong argument about it, and you will not convince me that I'm wrong. I'm positive that this is an effective mechanism in order to inform the public. And so when the war started in February of 22, I had to deal strategically. I had to deal with my own the conundrum of the fact that I run a software engineering shop where all of my engineers are living in that part of the world. That just that's just the way I organized it because I happen to speak fluent Russian and they speak Russian, and so we speak Russian, and then I have my Western clients and we build things for them. So it's totally bread and butter software. There's nothing in any way it wasn't in any way activist. It was just, I mean, and it isn't still. The company is called A Flat Minor. And, as I said, I'm a comedian. So up until February of 22, the company was actually called the Russian Mob. And the RussianMob.com is still there, although now it's defunct. But I renamed it because I thought it's just not funny anymore given given the circumstances.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, but so it's now called A Flat Minor, and we continue to build software. But so like my day-to-day reality was that I had these people that I had to worry about, and I did worry about them, and then I helped those of whom I could, how I could, which wasn't very much. And then I felt this very strong urge to do something more. And as you've now heard for the last 30 minutes or so, I have lots of ideas about the nature of information and the nature of psychology and sociology and human organization. And it dawned on me that Putin's propaganda machinery, which is it's incredibly good. Like I'm loath to compliment Putin on anything, but credit where it's due. He would make Goebbels blush in terms of like the way that they have organized their misinformation um, apparatus is truly impressive. And so the Russian population really can't be blamed for their delusion about the nature of what Ukraine is, what the world is, like all of these things. They are convinced and thoroughly convinced that they are the victims of a global um, campaign to eliminate them from the stage of authority and or efficacy or success of any kind. They also like the Russian population genuinely believe that Russia is an important nation in some geopolitical sense and not just a horrible thorn in everybody's side, which generally it has been for the last 50 years. Um, and so the question becomes if we're going to undermine Putin, I mean, I believe it is essential that that undermining come from within, right? Because I mean, we can get into the history of geopolitical interventionism, and my take is that America has had very little success in imposing any kind of change from the outside. But when we simply lead by example and show people what Western liberalism can lead to when applied rationally and honestly, the outcomes are quite good. And those nations that have taken up this project over the last 100 years in kind of following us, and I'm being I'm obviously very very broadly speaking in terms of
Yeah.
America's role in
Yeah.
all of this, but
Yeah.
if we can agree that America's sort of kicked the ball and people are running with it. My point is if we're in the end if we're gonna wind up having to go into Russia in tanks, that's going to fail. Or if it's not, and again, the examples abound. Where we arrive in tanks, things don't seem to work out in our favor. But where we arrive with good intentions and good examples and the honest desire to do trade and stuff, things seem to move in the right direction. So the urge was to build something that can undermine Putin's propaganda machinery and arm the public with the ability to engage one another with information that they currently can't reach. So very, very, very briefly, the nature of the enterprise is that what Putin is doing is he is banning, blocking, censoring all sorts of internet stuff. There's like 140,000 different websites that are blocked, from Facebook and Twitter to chess.com to bbc.co.uk. Like if you type those domains in your browser or on your phone in Russia, you will find DNS not found, and that's it. So I thought, okay, if we can build something that creates access to those pieces of information and then give people the ability to distribute that amongst themselves, that in effect recreates the Samizdat ethos and the Samizdat mechanism, and gives the people the ability to remain informed and more importantly, inform each other. Because, excuse me, the it's not enough to give people who are already seeking access, because you always have that some percentage of the population that is very intent on being informed, and they don't believe the propaganda and they find ways around it. But
Hmm.
but then there's some number, and in this case it's the majority, who are misinformed, uninformed, ill-informed, disinformed, and a top-down approach of informing them is just it is too much. It's not going to work. We can't, because the top-down approach, that particular angle is occupied by the Kremlin. They have
Hmm.
that buttoned up. So it's only from within that we're going to be able to get people,
Hmm.
re-educated, to use a very blunt term. So yeah, so we built a thing the technology of it is actually reasonably straightforward. We register tons and tons and tons of domain names that mean nothing. They're just random domain names, and then we proxy the content within those domain names so that when the Roskomnadzor, which is Russia's primary organ of censorship, when they come after these domain names, it turns into a whack-a-mole game where every time they find a domain name, they will ban it. But that's okay because we've got, endless more on the heels coming down the pike. And as long as people know how to find our website one way or another, we will keep handing them these new links, which we generate on the fly, and then they can continue to distribute them amongst themselves. So in the end, we are guaranteed victory because we can produce links much faster than they can ban them.
Wow. Okay. I think I understand. That's astonishing. So I've thought about this kind of a dynamic before with the advent of generative AI, the Chat GPT and OpenAI and all these generative AI services now, how feasibly those AI could proliferate information and just create all kinds of URLs and just disseminate just like compound information. But it sounds like you're doing perhaps something similar except you're doing it in the service of making information available to people rather than just proliferating nonsense or junk or disinformation. Does that sound like there's something or that am I describing that at least partially right?
Well, we are the primary functionality is built out of the most core internet, like the way the internet was designed, the most core internet features,
Hmm.
so AI could potentially play a role in this at some point in the future. Um, but for us, it's just not part of what we are focused on,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
the way that this works is, um, you have the infrastructure of the internet. Is there are some things that require labor, like generating a domain name and registering the domain name and
Hmm.
getting that domain name distributed to all the DNS machines across the globe. And that labor is fairly intensive. I
Oh,
mean,
so that sorry to interrupt. So what you were just describing, that is something, at least as of this moment, cannot be done with AI, or it's something that you are not doing with AI,
um,
or both.
well, it's a very manual thing. The
Uh-huh.
AI really has no advantage here. Like, what I'm trying to think of what an AI, like either a large language model or a machine learning system, or like they can generate content, they can analyze content,
Hmm.
but this is just a distribution scheme, right? This is
Right.
how do we get this content delivered via as many, in this case, domain names as possible, right?
Hmm.
So there is no AI product that I can hook this up to that would in any way improve upon what we have, which is that we just generally randomly generate a domain sequence of characters, right? So it's going to
Yeah.
be ABC123
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
and then we register that, we assign it to some server living somewhere in the world, and then generate links pointing at that. Now, the links themselves are, I mean, they're scrambled, but they point to real content. So they point to articles in one of, like, we are partnering with about 70 different banned media organizations across mostly the Russian language sphere, although we for a while we were leaning into the Farsi language sphere as well, and we're targeting China eventually, but because these links work everywhere, Russia would just happen to be the first place we started. Um, but the content exists. We maybe at some point down the line will become a producer of content, and maybe at that point AI will play some role. Certainly, we have an ambition to actually translate a lot of the content that we are currently proxying and store it, make it searchable, index it with Google, so that if somebody types, for example, if they type the word Navalny using English letters, presently you will not, like, if you do that right now, Google will not give you results for articles about Navalny where the word Navalny is in Cyrillic,
Oh, really?
even though it's there that you would potentially find the most interesting and the most informative information about him. So and so similarly, I'm using that as an example. Similarly, any topic where the original language would contain content much richer, deeper, more informative, Google doesn't index it because it's just using the tokens in the characters that they are presented in. So again, information about Israel, information about Iran, information about the Sudan, whatever, you can go across the globe. That information is best in the original languages, but that's not how Google works. So that's a place where AI could absolutely help. And a product like Babel Street is already doing things of that nature. But I mean, they're doing it specifically for OSINT threat detection kind of stuff. But the point is, the underlying feature set is there.
I see.
But that's
I
not
see.
what we do.
I see. Are are you familiar with a project? I'm sure you are. It's called the Wayback Machine.
Yes, of
Uh,
course.
Um, is is your technology um, similar at all to the Wayback Machine technology? Where so my under well, first of all, do you think you could just give a quick 101 on what the Wayback Machine is, and is your technology at all similar to that kind of you know information housing technology?
So the Wayback Machine is a project which endeavors to simply catalog and archive all the internet
Yeah, yeah.
for posterity.
And
Uh,
it takes like snapshots, like weekly or monthly snapshots or something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah.
I tinkered with it way, like, I was introduced to Mark. I believe his last name is Terrell.
Oh,
He's
really?
the main guy there. Anyway, I know his name is Mark. Mark, forgive me if you're hearing this and I'm
Okay.
butchering your last name.
Yeah.
He's a lovely fellow, and we spoke, and he is also a big enthusiast for what we're doing. So at the time when I looked at what it is, what you're describing sounds correct, right? It's snapshots of individual things on the internet, basically going back as far back as they could find and as broadly as they can catalog. But as far as I know, and again, if I'm lying, then I'm begging forgiveness. But as far as I know, they don't analyze the data. They simply catalog it. So if you wanted to scour content from 10 years ago, but you were looking for it in the wrong language,
Hmm.
I don't think that it would find it for you because it's not doing real-time analysis and translation or anything like that. It's just archiving
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
And to be clear, we're not doing that either. That's an ambition that we would love if somebody were to ever give us any money, which so far they have not. We would definitely build that mechanism because I think it would be very useful so that when people go searching in Google for stuff, they would find it on our website. But again, they would only find it on our website because we were the ones who cataloged it and translated it. But the original content would still be coming from whatever the source of that original content was. In this case, one of these many exiled media publications. And I do want to mention the publications. Like, so broadly speaking, we're talking about Medusa, Media Zona, Echo of Moscow, TV Rain. There's many of these organizations that were and I mean, they are legitimate news outlets that were operating within Russia up until 2 years ago. And then basically overnight, they all became criminal enterprises because they continued to speak the truth, whereas the truth became a criminal offense. So they all had to flee, and they did. They're all living in Europe at this point. I can list the countries, but they're the countries you would imagine they'd be in. They're in Germany and they're in Latvia, etc. Um, but the point is that these are without these organizations, Samizdat would be able to do nothing because we are not producing content. We're simply relaying content. But this content is incredibly well produced. It's incredibly well researched. It's very professionally developed. And I would encourage Westerners to read it because a lot of it's actually in English. But even if it isn't, you hit Google Translate and it does a very reasonably good job of giving you you'll understand what you're reading, obviously, even if some of the turns of phrase will be a little awkward. And that information is much more informative, like you just using that word in its rawest way, much more informative than what you find in the Western outlets, which I find it very fascinating how slightly wrong, but all that slight wrongness adds up to a complete misinterpretation of what's going on. If you're reading the New York Times day in and day out about what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, you are going to be completely confused about what's actually happening there because they are not covering it anywhere near as accurately as places like Medusa.
I see. Yeah. As you were talking, I looked up the Wayback Machine. We'll have a link in the show notes. Mark Graham. Mark
Sorry.
Graham. Yeah. Really interesting project. Okay. Well, your project is, just dynamite, Genia. So, I think you covered this already, but maybe just more directly, who is your technology for, and what success are you having?
So the way that I envisioned this thing working, and maybe naively so, was I was imagining that samizdatonline.org, which is where you'll find this particular
Okay. Yep.
endeavor,
We'll have link in the show notes. Yep.
would become sort of a Yahoo of the banned press, right? 1990, not today's Yahoo, 1995's Yahoo of the banned Russian language press, and that people would come there from across the globe. They'd want to be informed, and one of the features there was that it gives you links that you can then send. So if you know people who happen to be living in Belarus or in Russia, or as the technology and the media structure grows, in other regimes that are oppressed, repressed, and censored by their dictators, you'd be able to grab links and then just send them along, and in whatever mechanism you communicate with people right? So you'd be sending things in email or in WhatsApp or whatever, Telegram and Signal. And people would be receiving those links, reading them, sending them on, and those links would live their own little lives, and then you would send new links eventually. Also, people would, through those links, be able to sign up to our newsletter, which then gives you access to samizdatonline.org from within whatever country, because we're also banned in Russia, obviously. So if you're in Moscow and you type in samizdatonline.org into your browser, you will find a DNS not found, just like you would if you were going to Facebook. But once you've been given access to us via one of our circuitous links, that access will then, you can just continue to go there using that link, or if that link dies, then you can subscribe to our newsletter, find us on Telegram, whatever. You will know that we exist, and then you'll be able to get to us one way or another. The whole point is to not need VPN. I failed to mention that earlier because, again, as a grassroots enterprise, the people, let's call them the 25% of the people that are in the know and they use VPN and they're all happy and satisfied, or they're unhappy, but they know how to get to banned materials. But the 75% don't, and usually they're older people. Frequently, they're people who have absolutely no experience with technology. And so if you want them to read something that is banned and you tell them, well, you need to install this VPN in order to do that, that's not going to happen. So these links facilitate that conversation and that access without any additional tech. That's kind of the point.
I see.
So how successful are we? We are entirely unsuccessful
Okay.
I mean, so it depends on how you measure success. In terms of our relationships with all this exiled media, we're incredibly successful. You know, as I said, there's 70 some publications who think we're wonderful and who are really happy to collaborate with us and are happy that we're delivering their content. And we're successful in that the technology works. And I now have, in the recent past, tested it in China, and it works in China. So all of the negative and pessimistic predictions that many of my colleagues in this world made about how, you know, yeah, sure, maybe it works in Russia, but it'll probably not work in Iran or China. They are wrong. It does work in Iran and China perfectly at this time. Obviously, that doesn't mean that Iran and China won't come after it with a vengeance once it's actually being useful to the public. But you know, I predict that we will be able to outmaneuver them when that happens. But in terms of actual use, the problem is that, as I said, we have found no willingness for anyone to fund this. Like we can't find any. You know, the NGOs all seem to not really grasp what we're doing, and they all turn us away politely, saying that we don't line up with their mandates. Investors don't seem to think that this is going to be a way for them to make money, which, you know, for all I know, maybe it's not. Maybe it really probably should be a nonprofit endeavor, and at this point, it is. The Samizdat Online is a nonprofit endeavor. We have broken out the technology into a separate company called Ratatasker, which is the for-profit. If you're listening to this and you feel like investing in this or donating to it, we could absolutely use your support. But without that support, the thing that we're really missing is the operational horizontality. Like I can't spin up enough machines or register enough domains. So what happens is, it as a proof of concept, it works brilliantly. But if we were to announce via one of our very well subscribed media partners like Medusa, right? Medusa has, I think, the 15 million active monthly readers. So if Medusa said to their readers, "Hey guys, Samizdat Online is here. Go use them to find us, to distribute us, whatever," their readers would, right? So then some meaningful percentage of that 15 million would come and use our platform tomorrow, but we would fall over because we simply don't have the resources to sustain that kind of traffic. So it's a really horrible catch-22 where no one is providing us with the resources to support that sort of traffic, and simultaneously I can't, I don't want the experience for most people to be that they showed up and the thing broke. So that
Right.
you know, that, like, because first impressions are everything. So we've kind of, you know, I've been making the rounds and going to conferences and gathering all sorts of very valuable allies, and you know, you mentioned Josh, and
Yeah.
he's a wonderful fellow whom I only met fairly recently, but this I've become pretty well known in this particular world, and it's, you know, this is the world of this, you know, OSINT and anti-autocracy, pro-democracy advocacy. But for whatever reason, there's just no like somewhere we're not catching the right people's attention, and so I'm just continuing to do my part in trying to promote this thing, and thank you very much for playing
Yeah,
a part in
yeah.
that.
Well,
Um,
I just want to, ask, so for our audience, interested audience members, what's the best way for someone to get a hold of you if they wanted to?
so my email is the first letter of my first name, which is Y, and then my last name Simkin at samizdatonline.org. There's also a link on our website which takes you to info at, but I'll receive that as well,
Okay.
as well some people on our team. Let's see, I guess, I mean, you can just Google me, you'll find me
Okay.
immediately. I'm not
All
a
right.
difficult person to locate.
Okay, great. Well, we'll have links in the show notes to Samizdat Online so that people, also your Bulwark site too, so people can get a hold of you if they would like. I'd like to go into a quick lightning round kind of a thing with
Oh boy.
maybe like 30 to 60 seconds per response, and
Sure.
then close it out. Ask you for your thoughts on a research question and a book suggestion. So lightning round first. Lightning round. AI, artificial intelligence.
Um, all
This
right.
is
So,
your extemporaneous thoughts on these very
okay, my
basic
extemporaneous
topics.
thoughts on AI is that the modern world of non-tech media has completely misunderstood what AI is. And now everybody's really up in arms about the fact that tomorrow the AI is going to come for everybody's jobs, and that if you're an accountant or if you're teaching physics at a local community college, very soon AI is going to be doing that on your behalf. And that is not true. AI is my metaphor is AI is a circus bear on a bicycle juggling bowling pins, which is incredibly impressive when you look at it and you're like, wow, how did they get a bear to juggle bowling pins while riding a bicycle? That's amazing. And it is amazing. But you know what that bear isn't going to be doing tomorrow is teaching physics at a community college. Like we're at the apex of what the bear's going to do. It's going to ride a bicycle. Maybe they'll get it to ride a unicycle. Maybe they'll get it to juggle an extra bowling pin. But that's it. So everyone can take a breath. We're all good.
Okay, fair enough. Next lightning round. NATO.
Oh boy. Um, NATO is well, okay, this is my biggest argument for why people should not be voting for Donald Trump. Because whatever else you think about him, he's made some very, very scary noises about how he feels about NATO, and NATO is an essential mechanism to keep Russia at bay. It was, I'll remind everyone, constructed to keep Russia at bay. That's what it was point was originally, and it's clearly done a pretty good job of it because Putin keeps worrying that as long as NATO is there and as long as it's really powerful, he can't have his way with Europe as he clearly would like to, evidenced by what he is doing in Ukraine. So it's really vital that NATO be preserved, and so I'm voting for Kamala Harris.
Okay, all right. Just a not a political podcast, but our guests are certainly allowed to have their political
Well, that's
opinions.
my point of view.
No,
I'm
no,
just
it's
arguing
good.
against
It's all it's all
I'm saying
good.
whatever
It's all
else you
good.
think, that's a really vital way to think about this particular election.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. All good. All good. Last lightning round, China.
China. Okay, China, I think in terms of something I could say that's useful is that people in the press are covering China incorrectly. They're covering China as a success story, which in some ways, of course, it is, but that success story is predicated on China's ability to take advantage of everything that has happened in the Western capitalist world. And so the problem with China is that it presents this very weird mirage of maybe autocracy is not so bad. Like that is the thing that a lot of people walk away looking at China feeling like, look, these people seem to have gotten it right, and their trains run on time, and they've pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and that's all true. They have. The price they've paid for that, obviously, aside from the fact that now they have no children, is that they've painted themselves into a kind of a corner, and none of that could have been possible. Like China would not have been able to pull itself up by its own bootstraps without all of the capital that was without becoming the world's factory for our cheap crap, which we are addicted to. So it's an important thing to keep in mind when you're tempted by the maybe autocracy is really not so bad after all meme, which has been going around a lot lately.
Okay, great. All right. So, like I said, wrap up with a couple of typical questions. Do you think you could offer a research question that a interested student might examine if they want to, you know, further the kinds of agenda items that you and your colleagues are pursuing?
Yeah, so one thing that becomes very evident very quickly when you start examining this world is it's very, very hard to gauge what people within some unreachable part of the world are actually thinking. Like there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
speculation about what are the Russians thinking, and how do those, obviously they don't think as a monolith, like how do the different points of view break down along various positions, and what percentage of the population is fond of Putin or not fond of Putin or interested in are appreciative of the way that they are being protected from the internet versus resentful of it, etc. And so the question is, if you were to go about researching this sort of uh, uh, point, like this statistical point of view, how would you go about doing that? And I think that if people start in endeavoring to do that, they will find some very interesting problems that are very hard to solve very quickly. And then so that might lead them to novel solutions, which this world could really use. Because right now, this, getting at what people are thinking and having an accurate measure of it is something that is extremely hard and largely unreliable and frequently very wrong.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, for sure. And then finally, do you have a book recommendation, or could be an online resource recommendation? Again, that is maybe a favorite of yours or something that you would point our audience towards.
Yes, there is a book. Well, actually, I have two books, but the main
Okay.
book that I would recommend everyone to read is a book called "I Love Russia," and I'll send you the link to it in
Okay,
the
great. Yeah.
show notes. It's written by a journalist. She spends most of the book traveling between Moscow and St. Petersburg in the parts of the country that are between those two civilization points, and the readers will find themselves, or speak for myself, I found myself hard pressed to believe what she's describing because it reads like a dystopian nightmare that we usually find in Hollywood films from what happens after, a nuclear war. And this is the reality of how people in Russia are living today. And it's a really, really good um, counterbalance to the kind of absurdity that Tucker Carlson rolled out when he went on his PR tour in Moscow a couple of months ago, describing the nation as being highly successful. This book it really burns that idea to the ground and shows you how people in Russia actually are living. So in any case, if anyone's tempted by that, again, by the idea that maybe the autocrats have a way to optimize our way of life, because they really don't. And then the other book is called Putin's People, and it describes Putin's ascent to power and the way that it's just a very, very well researched and incredibly engaging read for the way Putin has built what he has built over the last 25 years. So I would recommend both of those books.
All right. Well, we will have links to all of these resources and to Genia's Samizdat online website for people to go check out. And with that, Genia Simkin, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
John, thank you so much for having me. Really, it's been a pleasure.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.